Broderick Thorne never thought he'd find himself in a psychologist's waiting room at the age of 27. He sat in a soft leather chair, absent-mindedly leafing through a glossy magazine he held upside down. The hands of the wall clock lazily counted down the minutes to the appointed time, and their quiet ticking only increased his inner tension. The reception area was tastefully decorated, muted tones on the walls, a few abstract paintings in simple frames, and live plants arranged as if their arrangement had been carefully thought out by a feng shui expert. The latest issues of Psychology Today, The Wall Street Journal, and National Geographic were stacked perfectly on the coffee table. Rick, that's what his friends and co-workers called him, absent-mindedly adjusted the knot of his dark blue tie. He had just left the county courthouse, where he had spent the morning defending the interests of another client of his law firm. The Brooks Brothers suit still fit impeccably, even as the day drew to a close. Tall, with straight features and a strong-willed chin, Rick was used to impressing others. But now, in this quiet reception area, he felt uncomfortable, like a freshman before an important exam. The office door opened, revealing the previous visitor, a middle-aged man in a rumpled suit who, without raising his eyes, hurried toward the exit. "Mr. Thorne?" a melodious voice called out. "Please come in." Rick looked up and froze for a moment. Standing in the doorway was a woman who looked nothing like the image of a psychologist he had formed in his head. Dr. Otam Blackwood was a tall blonde with impeccable posture. Her hair was gathered in an elegant bundle, and her strict gray suit emphasized her slender figure. But what struck him most were her eyes, light gray and attentive, and they seemed to see right through him. "Yes, of course." Rick stood up, pulling on his jacket. Dr. Blackwood's office was as elegant and professional as she looked. The large window overlooked the park, giving the illusion of privacy in the middle of the bustling city. Two comfortable sand-colored chairs stood at an angle to each other, with a small table with a carafe of water and glasses between them. On the walls, diplomas in frames and a few landscapes made by watercolors. "Sit down wherever you like," she pointed to the chairs. "Would you like some water?" "No, thank you." Rick chose the chair closest to the window. "What brings you to me, Mr. Thorne?" Dr. Blackwood sat down across from me with her notebook on her lap. Her movements were smooth, confident. Rick ran a hand through his hair, a gesture that betrayed his uncertainty. "To be honest, I'm not sure what I'm doing here myself. My partner in the firm, Adrian, suggested I go to a specialist after the divorce." She made a quick note in her notebook. "Divorce is always a difficult time. When did this happen?" 3 months ago." Rick looked out the window where the wind was playing with the leaves of the trees. "Celeste and I had been together since college. Everything seemed perfect, a successful career, a house in Georgetown, plans for the future, and then what happened?" Dr. Blackwood gave him a gentle nudge. "We became strangers." He grinned unhappily. "It sounds like a cliché, but it's true. I came home one day and realized that Celeste and I hadn't had a real conversation in weeks, just about bills, shopping, weekend plans. It was like we'd turned into roommates." Dr. Blackwood nodded understandingly, and the light from the window created a sort of halo around her head for a moment. Often couples who have been dating since they were young encounter this. We grow, we change, and sometimes the paths diverge. Rick noticed her tapping the tip of her pen on her notepad, a subtle gesture that caught his attention for some reason. Celeste had said pretty much the same thing when she left. Took her stuff, her cat, and half the furniture. He tried to smile. "You know what the weirdest thing is? I miss the cat more than I miss her." That brought a slight smile to Dr. Blackwood's face. "Do you have any pets right now?" "No," Rick shook his head. "My apartment is too quiet now. Sometimes I turn on the TV just for background noise." While she was making another recording, Rick noticed the wedding ring on her finger. Simple, elegant, with a small diamond. "How do you cope with being alone?" she asked, looking up from her notebook. "I work a lot." Rick shrugged. "There's always something to do at a law firm. Sometimes I stay in the office until midnight. At home, there are too many memories at home." "Have you thought about moving?" "I have, but it feels like admitting defeat." He looked at his hands. Like I'm finally admitting that our marriage is really over. Dr. Blackwood set aside her notebook and stepped forward a little. Mr. Thorne, accepting reality is not defeat. It's the first step toward healing. Her voice was soft but confident. A sense of calm and professionalism emanated from her that involuntarily made one trust her. Just Rick, please, he met her gaze. Mr. Thorne is my father. Okay, Rick, she nodded. I think we should start by discussing your expectations of therapy. What would you like to accomplish? The question caught him off guard. What did he want? A return to normalcy? To stop feeling this emptiness inside? To learn to trust people again? I want to feel whole again, he finally said. Right now it's like I'm stuck between the past and the future, and I don't know where to go from here. Dr. Blackwood made another note in her notebook. That's a good starting point, Rick. I suggest we meet once a week to start. Would you prefer morning or evening? Evening, after work. He glanced at the clock on the wall. About the same time. Great. She stood up and walked over to her desk where the computer was. Let's get you signed up for next week. Same time. Rick rose to follow, feeling strangely relieved. The hour had flown by, and although he wasn't sure therapy would help him, something about Dr. Blackwood inspired confidence. Thank you, Dr. Blackwood. Call me Odom, she smiled, handing him a business card. Here's my office phone number if you have any questions between sessions. Their fingers touched for a moment as he took the card, and Rick felt a slight prick of electricity from the touch. The business card was simple and elegant. White cardboard, black letters, no frills. Stepping out of the building onto the street, Rick took a deep breath of the evening air. The sun was already slipping toward sunset, coloring the skyscrapers of Washington, D.C. in golden tones. He pulled out his phone. 3 missed calls from coworkers and a reminder of tomorrow's court hearing. An ordinary evening in the life of a successful lawyer. But something had changed. Perhaps this was the beginning of something new, or the beginning of the end. Who knows? Rick slipped Dr. Blackwood's business card into the inside pocket of his jacket and headed for the parking lot where his black BMW was waiting for him. 2 months flew by. Weekly meetings with Dr. Blackwood had become as much a part of Broderick Thorne's routine as morning coffee or an evening briefing with colleagues. Every Thursday evening at 6 o'clock, he entered his familiar office, where a glass of water with lemon and a calming view from the window always awaited him. On this particular Thursday, it was drizzling a light rain. Rick had parked his car a little farther away than usual, and as he walked to the building, he was soaking wet. Shaking the drops off his coat in the reception area, he heard muffled voices coming from the office. From the tone, it sounded like a tense conversation was going on. Sterling, we'll discuss this at home. Odom's voice sounded unusually harsh. Of course, dear. At home as always. The man's voice oozed sarcasm. The door swung open and a tall man in his 40s, wearing an expensive suit and gold cufflinks that gleamed with every movement, stepped out of the study. His dark hair was touched with gray at the temples, and his gait had the confidence of a man accustomed to giving orders. He gave Rick an appraising glance, and without a word he headed for the exit. Rick, please come in. Odom appeared in the doorway. Her cheeks were slightly flushed and her eyes showed irritation, which she tried to hide behind a professional smile. As Rick entered the office, he noticed that one of the photos on Odom's desk was face down. He recognized the frame. The photo was of her with a man who had just stepped out. Her husband, Sterling Blackwood, a successful businessman who was sometimes written about in local business publications. I apologize for that scene. Odom fixed a dislodged strand of hair. Sometimes personal life intrudes on professional life. It's okay. Rick sat back in his usual chair. Everyone has difficult moments. She smiled gratefully and picked up her invariable notebook. How was your week? Rick leaned back in his chair, loosening the knot of his tie. Won the Harrison case. Remember I told you about it last week? Sure, she nodded. The corporate espionage case. That's right. The prosecutor was confident of victory, but I found inconsistencies in the testimony of the key witness. He allowed himself a slight smile. Now my firm is going to get a big bonus. You sound, not particularly cheerful despite the victory. Rick looked at her in surprise. Over the 2 months, he'd noticed how accurately she knew how to read his moods. You know, before I would have celebrated a victory like this with Celeste. Maybe we'd have dinner at that French restaurant she liked. He ran his hand over his face. Last night, I just went home, ordered Chinese food, and fell asleep in front of the TV. You don't miss Celeste, Otem said softly. You miss the rituals that were part of your life. Her words made him think. Perhaps you're right. I can't even remember the last time I cooked at home. Celeste and I used to cook together a lot on weekends. What do you like to cook? Pasta. Rick smiled at the memory. My grandfather was from Italy, taught me his signature sauce recipe. Said a real man should be able to cook at least one dish perfectly. Otem put aside her notebook and looked at him with interest. And why don't you make pasta tonight? For whom? He grinned bitterly. For an empty apartment? For yourself, Rick. She moved forward, and the light scent of her perfume reached his nostrils. You deserve to be taken care of, even if you're alone right now. Something in her voice, in the way she said those words, made his heart beat faster. He caught himself admiring the way the light fell on her hair, how graceful her neatly manicured hands looked. Maybe you're right. He tried to return to a professional tone. I've noticed that I've been treating myself sloppy. I've stopped eating on the run, stopped going to the gym. It's a normal reaction to stress, she nodded. But maybe it's time to take back control of your life. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of a phone, Otem's personal phone, which was lying on the table. The name Sterling popped up on the screen. She quickly muted it, but Rick had time to notice how her shoulders tensed. I'm sorry, I thought I'd muted it. It's okay. Rick paused. You know, I've been thinking maybe I should change our meeting times. If it's inconvenient, no, she answered too quickly. No, this time is perfect. We all have relationship difficulties. For the first time in all the times they'd met, she allowed herself a hint of privacy. Rick felt something change between them, as if the invisible wall had gotten a little thinner. Yes, they do, he agreed quietly. Their gazes met, and for a moment there was a pause filled with unspoken understanding. Otem was the first to break the silence. Next week I'd like to talk about your plans for the future. She returned to a professional tone. Have you thought about what you want to do next? To be honest, I've stopped planning ahead. Rick looked out the window where the rain had intensified, turning the city into a blurry watercolor. It all seemed so clear before. Career, family, kids. Now. And now? She nudged gently. Now I'm not sure of anything. He shifted his gaze to her. Except these meetings on Thursdays. Otem flinched slightly but maintained a professional expression. Our time is coming to an end, Rick. Don't forget the pasta tonight. Walking out of the building, Rick didn't immediately go to his car. He stood in the rain, feeling the cold drops dripping down his collar. The image of Otem stayed in his head, the way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, the light scent of her perfume, the tenseness in her shoulders when her husband called. On the way home, he stopped at the store and bought everything he needed for the pasta. Maybe it was time to start cooking for himself. Maybe it was time for something more. After all, life doesn't end with divorce. The last leaves of October were swirling outside Otem Blackwood's office window when everything changed. Their Thursday meetings had long since moved beyond the usual therapy sessions. Now they met at a nearby cafe, ostensibly to change the setting for more effective therapy. Rick knew he was fooling himself. Otem knew it too, but kept playing the game. That afternoon, she chose a table by the window in a small coffee shop on the corner of 17th Street. It was his favorite spot, overlooking the park where joggers gathered in the mornings and locals walked their dogs in the evenings. The waitress, who already knew their order, brought a double espresso for him and herbal tea for her. How's the Morgan case going? Otem asked, stirring the tea with a silver spoon. She was wearing a dark blue dress that perfectly accentuated the color of her eyes. Closed with a settlement. Rick sipped his coffee. The client is happy, although he could have gotten more if they'd gone to trial. But sometimes peace is better than war, he shrugged, especially when it comes to family business. Otem nodded understandingly, and a ray of sunlight caught a golden strand in her hair. Rick caught himself wanting to reach out and touch that light. You've gotten wiser over the months, Rick. Or more cynical, he smiled. There's a difference between cynicism and realism. Their fingers touched casually as she reached for the napkin. Neither of them jerked their hand away immediately. "Odom," Rick began, but she shook her head. "Not here." They met at the bar of the Fairmont Hotel that evening. It was far enough away from her usual places, and respectable enough not to raise too many questions. Odom had changed from her business dress to a black cocktail dress, and Rick was still in his after-work suit. "This is wrong," she said, looking into her martini glass. "I know." He ran his finger along the rim of his whiskey glass. "I'm married. I know. You're my patient." "Not anymore," he caught her eye. "We both know therapy ended 2 weeks ago." She didn't argue. Instead, she took a sip of her martini, leaving a lipstick mark on the glass. "Sterling's gone to London for 2 weeks," she said after a long pause. That wasn't an invitation. Or was it? The lines had become so blurred that Rick couldn't tell where the professional ended and the personal began. A week later, he was sitting in his office, reviewing documents on a new case, when the phone rang. It was a familiar number. "Are you busy tonight?" Otem's voice sounded different over the phone, more gruff. "No. Come by at 7. I'll text the address." He arrived at 115-7, parking the BMW around the corner from the address. It was an apartment in an old house in Georgetown, not the one where she lived with Sterling, as he later learned, but the place she was renting to work on a book. Otem opened the door in a silk robe, with a glass of wine in her hand. "You're early." The traffic wasn't very dense. They both knew it was a lie. He just couldn't wait any longer. The apartment turned out to be small but cozy. Antique furniture, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, an antique Persian rug. Everything spoke of good taste and a lot of money. "Does Sterling know about this place?" Rick asked, taking a glass of wine. "No." She sat down next to him on the couch. "And he wouldn't know." Their first kiss was inevitable, like a thunderstorm after a sweltering day. The wine was forgotten on the table. The silk of the robe slid beneath her fingers, and all boundaries were finally erased. Later, lying in bed and staring at the play of shadows on the ceiling, Rick realized that he had fallen in love, truly, deeply, hopelessly. Odom slept beside him, her hair spread across the pillow, and she seemed almost unreal in the moonlight. Their meetings became regular, 2 or 3 times a week, always in the same Georgetown apartment. Sometimes they cooked together. Rick had taught her how to make the same pasta from her grandfather's recipe. Sometimes they just talked for hours, just like they used to in her office, only now without the notepad and professional distance. But something changed when Sterling returned from London. Odom began canceling appointments, not answering messages for days on end, and when they did see each other, she seemed distracted, as if her thoughts were somewhere far away. One evening, Rick decided to surprise her by arriving early with a bottle of her favorite wine. As he walked up the stairs, he heard voices. "You think I don't see what's going on?" Sterling's voice was full of barely contained rage. "I don't know what you mean." Otem's reply sounded tired. "Your late meetings? Your mysterious phone calls? You think I'm an idiot? I'm working on a book, you know that." "The book? Of course it is. Is this new patient of yours part of the research?" Rick froze on the landing. His heart was pounding so loudly, he thought he could hear him at the door. "Don't you dare follow me." Otem's voice turned icy. "I'm not. Just open your eyes. The whole town is talking about it. A young lawyer who has lunch with his psychologist one too many times." The sound of a slap cut the air. Then quick footsteps were heard, a door slammed, and everything went quiet. Rick stood there for a few more minutes, clutching his bottle of wine, until he heard the front door slam downstairs. Only then did he get up and ring the bell. Odom opened almost immediately. Her cheeks were burning, her eyes glistening with tears. "Not now, Rick." She tried to close the door, but he held her back. "I heard. It's over." She didn't look him in the eye. "This was a mistake from the beginning." "Don't say that." He stepped forward. "We can—" "No, we can't." She finally looked at him. "Go away, please." That same evening, sitting in his empty apartment, Rick opened his laptop and started writing. Everything that had accumulated over the months, every encounter, every conversation, every moment of intimacy. He wrote until dawn, until his fingers began to ache from the keyboard. And the next day, he ran into Celeste at the grocery store. She looked good, tanned in a new dress, with a ring on her finger he hadn't seen before. "Rick!" She seemed genuinely happy to see him. "How are you?" "Fine," he tried to smile. "And you? Look happy." "I'm engaged." She showed him the ring. "Remember Michael from accounting?" Of course he did. Michael was always staying late when Celeste was working on reports. "Congratulations," he said, and was surprised that he really meant it. "Thank you," she said quietly. "You know, the divorce, it was the right decision, for both of us." Rick nodded, thinking about Otem, about their meetings, about how messed up everything was. "Yeah, you're probably right." Back at home, he opened his laptop and continued writing. It wasn't just a diary anymore. It was a story about love, betrayal, and manipulation. A story that had to be told. It was a chilly November morning. Rick sat in his car across the street from Sterling Blackwood's office, clutching a folder of printouts in his hands. 3 days ago, he'd started noticing oddities in Otem's behavior. Little details that had seemed random before were now adding up to a frightening pattern. It started with a randomly overheard phone conversation in their Georgetown apartment. Otem thought Rick was in the shower, but he forgot his towel and went back into the bedroom. "Yes, honey, everything is going according to plan." Her voice sounded unaccustomedly sweet. "He's totally in love, just like we wanted. No, Sterling, you mustn't interfere prematurely." Rick froze outside the door then, feeling a chill inside. He spent the next 2 days gathering information, reviewed old press articles about the Blackwood family, talked to colleagues who'd handled the Sterling cases. It's not a pretty picture. Their marriage to Sterling had been in trouble for years, but divorce would mean a loss of status and financial stability for Otem. The prenuptial agreement was rigidly drafted, unless Sterling himself violated its terms. For example, by using physical violence in a fit of jealousy. Rick grinned bitterly. He was just bait, a way to make Sterling lose control. All those meetings in public places, the coincidences when he and Otem had ended up in the same restaurant with Sterling, all carefully orchestrated. His musings were interrupted by the phone ringing. Otem. "Hi, honey." Her voice sounded as usual, gentle and a little playful. "Will you meet me tonight?" "Sure." He tried to keep his voice steady. "I have something important to discuss." "Is something wrong?" "We'll talk when we meet." It was business as usual in the Georgetown apartment. The lights dimmed, a glass of wine on the table, Otem's favorite jazz blasting from the speakers. She met him in the same silk robe she'd worn on their first night. "You seem tense." She reached up to kiss him, but Rick pulled away. "We need to talk." He pulled out a folder and placed it on the table. On top was a picture, Otem and Sterling at a charity event, she in a red dress, he in a tuxedo, the happy couple. "What's this?" Her voice shook. "The story of one manipulation." Rick opened the folder. "You know what's interesting? There have been 5 cases in the last year where patients complained about unethical behavior by their psychologists. 3 of them involved romantic relationships, and in all 3 cases, the psychologists lost their license." Otem sank slowly into the chair. "Are you threatening me?" "No, just telling you the facts." He pulled out another document. "And this is a copy of your prenuptial agreement. Interesting reading, especially the domestic violence clause. From where, it doesn't matter. What's important is that I understand your plan." Rick went to the window. "Make Sterling jealous, provoke him into aggression, get a divorce and half the fortune. That's clever." "You don't understand anything." She stood up. "It's not that simple." "No, it's very simple." He turned to her. "I was the perfect target, right? Recently divorced, emotionally vulnerable, successful enough to make Sterling jealous." "Rick, listen. You know what the funny thing is?" He chuckled bitterly. "I've actually fallen in love with you, for real." Otem took a step toward him. "My feelings were real too." "Don't lie, at least now." He shook his head. "I'm going to file a complaint with the ethics committee, and I have proof. Every meeting we had, every conversation we had was recorded in a diary." Her face changed, becoming hard and alien. "You won't do it. Why not?" "Because I know more about you than you think." She reached into her purse and pulled out a flash drive. "Remember the Morgan case? The settlement? I have proof that you forged some of the documents. Rick froze. You're bluffing. Am I? She smiled. Sterling is very thorough in vetting those who appear in my life. They stood across from each other like duelists before a shot. War, then? He asked quietly. You started it. Rick gathered up his papers and headed for the door. I'll give you until tomorrow. Either you surrender your license or I'll file a complaint. Rick! She called out to him at the door. Don't do anything stupid. He walked out without looking back. Detective Thaddeus Kincaid didn't like Mondays, especially rainy ones, and this Monday was particularly nasty. The call came in at 6 a.m. The body of a young man was found in an apartment on Massachusetts Avenue. What have we got? He asked, entering the spacious apartment overlooking the city. Detective Marlo Reed, his partner for the past 3 years, pulled herself away from her notepad. Broderick Thorne, 27 years old, attorney. Found by the housekeeper who comes in on Mondays. Preliminary cause of death is an overdose of sleeping pills. Suicide? Looks like it. She pointed to an empty pill bottle and a half-drunk glass of whiskey on the coffee table. But there was something interesting. She held out a leather-bound day planner to him. This was found on his desk. It looks like a personal diary, and there's a very interesting story in there about an affair with his psychologist. Kincaid opened the diary and ran through the last entries. Dr. Autumn Blackwood? That's the one. Respected specialist, married to Sterling Blackwood. The Blackwood? Kincaid whistled. Exactly, Marlo pointed to the last entry in the diary, dated last night. Listen to this. Tonight it ends. I can't live with the idea that everything was a lie, that every touch, every word was part of the game. She used me, but I still love her. It's fate's cruelest joke. Kincaid closed the journal and looked around. The apartment was spotlessly clean, save for an overturned bottle of whiskey by the couch. On the wall were law school diplomas and pictures of family and friends. The ordinary life of a successful young lawyer. We need to talk to Dr. Blackwood, he said finally, and her husband. I've already sent uniforms after them. Marlo nodded. They should be at the station in an hour. Kincaid looked again at the body of the young man the medical examiner was already bagging. Something about this story was bugging him. Maybe it wasn't as simple as it seemed at first glance. And there was something else, Marlo added. They found a folder of documents on his computer. It looks like he was gathering information on the Blackwoods, and there's something interesting in there about their prenup. Kincaid nodded. Looks like it's going to be a long Monday. At the Washington Police Department's 32nd Division, life began long before dawn. Detective Thaddeus Kincaid sat at his desk, piled with papers and files on the Thorne case. His fourth cup of coffee of the morning stood on the edge of his desk, next to an unfinished donut. His partner, Marlo Reed, was attaching new photos to the evidence board. So what do we have? Kincaid rubbed his tired eyes. His wrinkled brown jacket hung on the back of his chair and his tie was loosened. A successful young lawyer has an affair with his psychologist and then is found dead. And a very convenient suicide. Marlo tapped the crime scene photo with her pen. Too convenient. She looked fresher than her partner. Strict pantsuit, short dark hair styled, minimal makeup. Only the dark circles under her eyes showed that she hadn't slept last night either. Dr. Blackwood has arrived, the young officer announced as he peered into the office. Autumn sat in the interview room, impeccably dressed in a gray Chanel suit. Her blonde hair was gathered into a tight bun, and there was not a trace of makeup on her face. The image of a grieving woman had been thought out to the last detail. Dr. Blackwood. Kincaid sat down across from her, placing the case file on the table. Tell me, when was the last time you saw Mr. Thorne? Thursday in our regular session. Her voice sounded flat. He sounded upset. Upset? Marlo sat down on the edge of the desk. Why? Doctor-patient confidentiality. Not anymore, Kincaid interrupted her. Your patient is dead. Autumn folded her hands on the table, her wedding ring catching the fluorescent light. Rick! Mr. Thorne was still reeling from his divorce. He had seemed particularly depressed the last few weeks. So depressed that he'd started an affair with his counselor? Kincaid pulled out Rick's journal. A slight shiver ran down her face. but she quickly pulled herself together. "I don't know what you mean." "Do you?" Marlowe opened the diary. "We met again today at the Georgetown apartment. Autumn was wearing that silk robe I gave her last week. These are the fantasies of an unstable man." Autumn shook her head. "As his psychologist, I can tell you that he had a tendency to what? Documenting every encounter? Collecting evidence?" Kincaid laid out the photographs in front of her. "That's you on the security cameras at Marco's, and the bar at the Fairmont Hotel, and coming out of that Georgetown apartment." Autumn was silent for almost a minute. "I want to talk to my lawyer." After the interview, the detectives returned to their office. Marlowe went straight to the coffee machine. "She's hiding something," she said as she poured coffee into the filter. "Obviously," Kincaid slumped in his chair. "But is that enough for a murder charge?" "Detectives?" A young female officer knocked on the door. "Mr. Blackwood is here, and he's not alone, he's with a lawyer." Sterling Blackwood looked imposing in his $3,000 suit. His lawyer, a thin man with glasses, immediately pulled out a notebook. "My client is prepared to give information as to his whereabouts on the night of Mr. Thorne's death," the lawyer began. "I was in London," Sterling said confidently, looking straight into Kincaid's eyes. "I didn't arrive until this morning when I heard what had happened." "Can you confirm that?" "Of course." The lawyer pulled out a folder. "Plane tickets, check-in at the Dorchester Hotel, security footage, witnesses to business meetings. Mr. Blackwood was in important negotiations all those days. The alibi was ironclad." Kincaid went through the paperwork. It all matched up by the minute. After Blackwood left with his lawyer, there was another knock on the detective's office. This time it was Celeste Thorne, the victim's ex-wife. "I came as soon as I heard." She looked genuinely shocked. "I can't believe Rick. He couldn't have—" "Sit down, Mrs. Thorne," Marlowe said softly. "Tell me, when was the last time you saw your ex-husband?" "A week ago, at the supermarket." Celeste pulled out a paper handkerchief. "He looked strange, nervous. Said he was having some trouble at work, but he wouldn't say what kind of trouble." "Did he mention Dr. Blackwood?" "No, but, She hesitated. "I knew he went to her. People in the neighborhood said they'd seen them together in different places. I thought maybe it was part of the therapy." It was nearing evening when Marlowe noticed a discrepancy in the testimony. "Ted, look." She placed two documents in front of her partner. Autumn said the last time she saw Rick was Thursday at the session, but according to the security footage, she entered his house Friday night. Kincaid whistled. "Lied under oath. Interesting. One more thing." Marlowe pulled out printouts of bank statements. Sterling Blackwood made a large cash withdrawal the day before he left for London. "You think he might have hired someone?" "That would explain his perfect alibi." They kept working late into the night. New photos, notes, connections were appearing on the evidence board. The story was getting more and more convoluted. "Here's what's strange," Kincaid said, looking at the diagram. "If Sterling wanted to kill Rick, why now? Why not before, when he first found out about the affair?" "Maybe he found out something else?" Marlowe suggested. "Something that made Rick really dangerous?" At that moment, a young CSI ran into the office. "Detectives! We found something in Thorne's apartment. Microscopic scratches on the floor like something heavy was dragged, and traces of blood on the carpet, almost imperceptible. Someone tried very hard to clean it up." Marlowe and Kincaid looked at each other. "So not suicide," Kincaid said slowly. "And there's one more thing." The CSI pulled out an evidence bag. "We found this behind the radiator." In the bag was a cufflink with the initials SB, Sterling Blackwood, Marlowe whispered. "But he was in London," Kincaid reminded her, "with an ironclad alibi. Or wanted us to think so." Kincaid rubbed his temples. The case was getting more and more complicated. A rich husband with a perfect alibi, an unfaithful psychologist wife, a dead lover with a revealing diary. It's like classic noir without the cigarette smoke and jazz music. "Check all the surveillance tapes around Thorne's house again," he finally said, "especially the back door and the underground parking lot, and pull up Autumn's cell phone records for the last week. You think she might have been acting on her husband's orders?" "I think everyone has a part to play in this story, and we haven't seen the final act yet." After 5 days of investigation, Thaddeus Kincaid felt they were finally getting closer to a clue. On the desk in front of him was Sterling Blackwood's financial transaction report, the result of 3 days of work by the finance department. Next to it was a folder containing a statement from the doorman at Thorne's house, who had, possibly, seen a tall man who looked like Blackwood enter the building through the back door the night of the murder. Marlowe knocked on the door jamb, holding a cardboard stand with 2 glasses of coffee. "Good morning, partner. You look like you haven't slept." "That's because I didn't." Kincaid accepted the glass gratefully. The office smelled of stale coffee and papers. "Look what I found." He turned the monitor toward her. On the screen was an old newspaper article from 15 years ago. "Mysterious death at a Miami private clinic," Marlowe read. "What does that have to do with our case?" "Keep reading." A young psychology intern, one Otam Grayson, now Blackwood, was the last person to see the patient alive. The official theory was suicide due to depression. Marlowe sat down on the edge of the table, straightening a crease in her black pants. "And you think, I think our Dr. Blackwood has an interesting history." Kincaid opened the next file. A month after this incident, she moved to Washington, and 2 months later, she met Sterling Blackwood at a charity event. That's a pretty good introduction for an aspiring psychologist. "Exactly." He took a sip of coffee. "Now watch this." Bank statements appear on the screen. The day before he left for London, Sterling had withdrawn $50,000 in cash. The next day, a similar amount was deposited into the account of one James Rodriguez. And who's that? Ex-military, works for a private security firm. And guess who owns that firm? Sterling Blackwood. Marlowe shook her head. Bingo. At that moment, a young officer peeked into the office. "Detectives, there's a witness asking to talk. Says it's urgent." Waiting for them in the interview room was an older woman in a shabby tweed suit, Mrs. Patterson, Rick's roommate, on the floor. "I couldn't sleep, I kept thinking," she began, fiddling with the strap of her old-fashioned purse. "That night I heard voices, a man's and a woman's. They were arguing." "What time was that?" Marlowe asked, pulling out a notebook. "Around 11. I was just about to take a sleeping pill. I have insomnia, you know." She adjusted her glasses with a trembling hand. "At first I thought it was someone's TV playing loudly, but then there was this rumble, like something heavy had fallen." "And then what?" "Then it went quiet. And after a while I heard the door slam. Someone had left." "Did you see anyone?" "No, I didn't want to look through the peephole, but I heard footsteps, heels on the hardwood floors, a distinct sound." Marlowe looked at Kincaid. Heels means a woman. After the interrogation, they returned to the office. Marlowe went straight to the evidence board. "Something doesn't add up here, Ted." "What's that?" "All this evidence against Sterling, it's too obvious. The cufflink behind the radiator, the witness who may have seen him, the large sum of cash." She tapped the picture of the cufflinks with a pen. "It was as if someone was leaving us breadcrumbs on purpose." Kincaid leaned back in his chair, the springs creaking. "Do you think we're being led on a false trail?" "Don't you?" Marlowe walked to the window. A fine rain drizzled outside the window, turning the streets of Washington into a blurry watercolor. "Let's look at the facts. Sterling has the perfect alibi. He was in London, confirmed by dozens of witnesses and surveillance cameras. He could have hired someone. He could have. But why would such a careful man leave his cufflink at a crime scene?" She turned to her partner. "And why now? If he knew about his wife's affair, why had he waited so long?" Kincaid rubbed his chin, overgrown with 2 days' worth of stubble. "Do you have another theory?" Instead of answering, Marlowe pulled a copy of Rick's diary out of a folder. "Read the last entry before he died." "She used me," Kincaid began. "No, the next page." He flipped the sheet over. "I've gathered all the evidence. I'm going to the ethics committee tomorrow. She can't do this anymore. Hopefully, I'll have time to—" "The recording cuts off halfway through," Marlowe observed. It was as if he'd been interrupted. At that moment, a panting forensic scientist burst into the office. "Detectives, we found something interesting in the Georgetown apartment." He placed an evidence bag on the desk. Inside was a vial with traces of white powder. "It's a sleeping pill, very strong. It's the same one they found in Thorne's blood. But here's the interesting thing. Otam Blackwood's fingerprints are on it." "Where exactly did you find it?" Kincaid asked. "In the bathroom, behind the pipes. Looks like someone was trying to hide it." Marlowe picked up the evidence bag. And look at the date on the bottle. It was prescribed a week before Thorne's death. In whose name? That's the problem. The CSI pulled out another document. The prescription was written in the name of a patient of Odom's, a Sarah Wilson, but when we checked, that patient didn't exist. Kincaid rose slowly from the table. Check all prescriptions written to Autumn in the last year, and find me the security footage from the pharmacy where this prescription was obtained. Already working on it, the CSI nodded. One more thing. Remember that article from Miami? We found the police report. That patient died of a sleeping pill overdose, too. Marlowe and Kincaid looked at each other. Looks like our friend Sterling Blackwood wasn't the only one who wanted to get rid of Rick Thorne, Kincaid said slowly. And not the only one who might have done it, Marlowe added, looking at the picture of Otom on the evidence board. The question is, which one of them really did it? Kincaid walked over to the board and removed the picture of the cufflinks. It was starting to get dark outside the window. Another workday was coming to an end, but the investigation was far from over. There was a question hanging in the air that no one dared to say out loud. What if they had been chasing the wrong perpetrator all this time? It was the 7th day of the investigation. Washington was drowning in a dank November fog when Detective Kincaid received a call from the tech department. "Detective," the technician's voice sounded excited. "You need to see this." 15 minutes later, Kincaid and Marlowe were already in the lab. Surveillance footage flashed on the computer screen. "We checked all the records from the pharmacy where the prescription for the sleeping pills was obtained." The technician opened the file. "And we found this." Odom Blackwood appeared on the screen, receiving the drug. But the most interesting thing was what happened afterwards. She got into the car, where a man was waiting for her. "It was," Marlowe began. "James Rodriguez," Kincaid finished. "The security guard to whom Sterling had wired the money." "But look at the date," the technician enlarged the image. "It was 3 days before Blackwood made the transfer." Marlowe and Kincaid looked at each other. "She planned the whole thing in advance," Marlowe said slowly. "Used her husband's connections to set him up later. Not only that," the technician opened another file. "We found phone records. Otom called Rodriguez several times over the last month. And guess when the last call was? The night of the murder? That's right, 10:30 p.m., half an hour before Thorne's estimated time of death. We found Otom's fingerprints on the lamp," the CSI reported. "They were partial, so they weren't immediately recognized, and traces of her DNA on the victim's clothing." Kincaid listened, drumming his fingers on the table. "Coffee," he said suddenly. "They found traces of sleeping pills in his blood, but there was an untouched cup of coffee on the table. She brought it with her," Marlowe guessed. "Already drugged, just in case the lamp didn't work out. Double insurance." Kincaid shook his head. "And Rodriguez helped her fake a suicide." "Professional work," Marlowe said. "She's a psychologist. She knows what a suicide scene should look like." An hour later, they were on their way to arrest Otom Blackwood. She met them in her office, still flawless and calm. "I've been waiting for you," she said as Kincaid pulled out the handcuffs. "But you were late." On the desk was an envelope with a confession. She told everything, about Miami, where she'd first realized she could manipulate death, about meeting Sterling, who'd been her ticket to high society, about the patients she'd used for her own purposes. "Rick was special," she said in the interrogation room. "He really could have helped me, with his death or his love. But he chose the wrong path." "Why would you frame your husband?" Kincaid asked. "Insurance," she shrugged. "If you found evidence against me, you could always blame it on Sterling. He'd pay it off like he always did." "And Rodriguez?" "Dead," she said it without emotion. "Hunting accident last night." In the visiting room of the women's prison, Otom sat in front of a blank sheet of paper. Her publisher was waiting for the first chapter. She smiled and began to write, "Every psychologist is a bit of an actor. We wear masks to help others take them off. But sometimes, the mask grows so tightly on your face that you don't know where the role ends and you begin." It was raining outside the window, blurring the lines between heaven and earth, between truth and lies, between love and manipulation. Somewhere in the city, another psychologist has taken over Otom's office, and new patients are telling their stories, hoping for healing. Life goes on, leaving the past in folders labeled "Case Closed."